Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, to have such a generous introduction. Kate, wherever you are, I think she's trying to turn on my PowerPoint. Thank you so much, and Hoda, for the invitation. And thank you to some of the women in the room whose footsteps I feel very appreciative to be able to walk in this world as a feminist sociologist. I am constantly humbled when I get to meet some people whose work has shaped my own. And so thank you for all that you've done to create openings and opportunities, I think, for younger scholars and those of us that are starting our careers to be able to mainstream some of these conversations in, as you just heard, a security department where I work, or a security center where I work. I was in Sarajevo in 2013 as I was wrapping up a lot of the interviews and fieldwork for my first book project. And I remember walking into a museum that was right in the heart of Sarajevo. It had just opened, and I walked into the dimly lit exhibit hall, and I was confronted by large photographs of the lives lost at Srebrenica in 1995. The 8,000 boys and men who were murdered over 3 days. And the images in this exhibit hall were of the lives left behind. Images of discarded clothing, a stuffed animal lying on dirt, a woman's hands wringing. And I remember on the far end of the exhibit hall, a rotating slideshow of black and white images that were flickering while I was walking around the exhibit. They appeared to be from the siege of Sarajevo, images of children running for cover, well-dressed men and women seemingly walking for work and then taking shelter behind a car or a structure of some sort. Modern sidewalks being hit with mortar shells and explosions. Tanks outside of residential buildings, the ubiquitous images of humanitarian aid distribution centers. Other images reflecting urban war. And they barely registered with me until I began to walk out of this gallery. When I started watching the images with a bit more attention, I realized that they were not from Sarajevo, but they were rather images from Syria. And every single one of the images had been taken in the past 12 months. It was something about that moment that horrified me, as it brought history to the immediate present. Nearly 20 years after the end of the wars in Bosnia and in Rwanda, it was dawning on me how little had fundamentally changed. And it was since that moment that I have been focused less on championing gender equality or women's rights, and more, often for the reasons that Laura Joberg mentioned earlier, focused on eradicating violence in its myriad forms. The violence in our world today can look as it did in that museum: weapons, armed combatants, civilians fleeing. It can also look like the ongoing armed conflict today that unfolds in Yemen, where a child dies every 12 minutes from the effects of the war. It can look like what continues to unfold in Afghanistan, where this past weekend, 40 civilians were killed in an anti-Taliban raid backed by US airstrikes. We see it over and over again on our news feeds: instability in Libya, conflict in northern Mali, and in Somalia and elsewhere. We also see this violence in the undeclared wars, not between states and rebel groups or proxy powers, but between narco-criminal organizations, such as in Mexico, where 17,000 people lost their lives last year. Or perhaps in the 11,000 odd people that are killed by firearms in the United States, many in the 289 mass shootings that have already occurred in 2019. So often the violence in our world does not look only like guns and bullets, but rather like the generations of Palestinians who are growing up displaced from their homelands, the population of Rohingya who have been driven out of Myanmar, the deafening silence of the lockdown in Kashmir, the imperialism of borders that determine movement on the basis of citizenship privileges, the unbridled capitalism that is melting ice caps and wreaking havoc on our climate. We also see it in how violence morphs and twists to embed itself in our institutions, our homes, and our bodies for generations. It is present in the carceral system in the US, with roots in our country's founding and a system of enslaved labor. And the fact that we stand here today, as Meg mentioned, on Indigenous land, in a room dubbed the Colony Ballroom. The trauma of these legacies of violence that are not transformed are transferred. And this reflects what our recently late great friend, Cynthia Coburn, called continuums of violence. Her work shapes mine so profoundly, and it's, for me, meaningful to be able to speak about these continuums with her memory on my own mind. Can we even imagine a world free from these myriad manifestations of violence? I challenge you. And is equality possible? Gender equality, racial equality, class equality, is it even possible, and should it even be our focus when such profound structural, physical, and symbolic violence exists? If you're anything like me, your imagination of that world that is free from violence has been dulled, has been limited by our constant exhaustion and feelings, kind of the lack of urgency around these crises. It feels overwhelming. I think our imaginations have also been limited by our exposures to violence and to colonial legacies of epistemic violence that have structured our very learning to think about what is possible, what we know is possible. And what I've needed, and what I suspect many of us may need, is a chance to reimagine and re-envision what a world would look like that prioritized the full and complete emancipation of all human beings from any form of harm. I put forth to you today that it is incumbent on us to develop our feminist imaginations in order to envision this new paradigm. My goal with my talk today is to provide some food for that revisioning process, some food in the form of stories. I have been remarkably fortunate over the past 4 years, since I arrived at the University of Denver, to be amongst colleagues and a community that has tried to reimagine what a university of higher education looks like. Scholars and colleagues that are interested in bridging the gap between the research we produce within the university and the world at large. I think too often we spend thousands and thousands of dollars and countless hours conducting research that rarely impacts, that rarely lands in communities and in the world at large because of paywalls, because of the cost of academic books, because of the astronomical cost of higher education that has left so many of us in crushing debt. My colleague Erica Chenoweth and I decided to imagine what it would look like if our university was focused not only on educating the students fortunate enough to walk through its doors and pay its hefty tuition fees, but instead finding ways of flipping what is conventionally considered expertise within the academy to recenter these experts in our classrooms and at the center of our rooms. We wanted to find a way to take our department, which has this strong tradition in security, and reimagine more holistically what security means. And we recognize that we are in a very, very difficult global political moment, that we see the rise of right-wing populists across the globe, the erosion of human rights, the backsliding of women's rights, LGBTQI rights, minority rights, the decline of democracy, the shrinking of civic space, the erosion of freedoms of the press. And the program which we designed is, at its core, an effort to elevate and amplify the work that women-identified activists are doing to counter these worrying trends, to push back against oppression, and to challenge violence in all of its forms. Through this project, I've met so many remarkable, groundbreaking women, the less known Greta Thunbergs of the world, that are fighting every day in their communities against these forms of violence, and have been very fortunate recently to begin a book project with my colleague Jill Hero that captures some of these stories. And so this is the first time I'm talking about this book project, and I'm really excited to share some of this with you today. I want to introduce these stories, but I also want to acknowledge the remarkable privilege I have to be standing here being the one to tell you these stories. And it's quite an unjust irony, I think, in some ways, that it's me. This is a picture of the program that we run at DU. I'll talk about it more a little later. I want to start by telling you Claire's story. Claire grew up in a middle-class family near Waterford in the south of Ireland as she described it, white, middle-class, English-speaking woman in a country where that is just the norm. She had her first child early, at 22. At the time, she considered having an abortion. She hadn't imagined getting pregnant so young, but it was expensive, it was inconvenient. She would have had to travel to England and spend more than $2,000 on that whole process because abortion remained illegal in Ireland. She had a partner, she had a supportive family, so she ended up having her daughter, Carla. She got married, she became a stay-at-home mom, which she loved, and several years later, she had a son. In Claire's words, all of it was going well, and then I was pregnant with my third child. Complete accident, completely. I was not expecting that at all. Nathan, her son, was only a year old, and he was just starting to walk, and she's thinking, I can't be pregnant again. How did this happen? Oh my God, it's terrible. But finally, we got our heads around the fact that we were gonna have another baby. We came to terms with it. This was in 2015. At Claire's 22-week scan, she was told their baby was going to die. Her baby's symptoms were so severe, it had a trisomy protein, and the way that it had manifested left the baby with a deformed face. Her placenta was covered in cysts. It was extremely distressing, and as Claire put it, really, how does this happen to a baby? It seemed so unfair. Claire's overwhelming emotion at this point wasn't grief yet. It was terror. Terror of what it would feel like to have a child within you that you knew would not be alive when it came into the world. Claire asked for an abortion. No, the doctor said, doesn't happen in Ireland. Claire described to me how she figured there was an Irish way of doing things, some way of getting it done just in the back of the hospital, not in the front, but some way of getting it done. This couldn't be something that in Ireland in 2015 we actually didn't offer. The doctor repeated, no. Going to England was no longer a possibility. She was past that point in her pregnancy, and it was going to cost 2,000 euros. Claire didn't have it. She also had 2 older children and didn't have childcare. Instead, Claire's doctor told her that she just needed to go home and wait for her baby to die. This was likely going to happen before birth. A midwife explained to her very clinically, what's going to happen is one day you'll go a full 24 hours without movement, and that's the day you'll know. Then you can come in here, we'll do a scan to confirm, and then we can talk about induction. In Claire's words, the surreal kind of conversation where the midwife is sitting there and telling you how you're going to be able to tell when your baby has died inside of you. I just couldn't get over the cruelty of it. They even started telling me about how to start taking pills to stop the breast milk from coming in because I'd breastfed before. That killed me. It absolutely killed me. Claire went home, and all of a sudden it was like, she said, I didn't count. I was literally a vessel, a pregnancy. I did everything I could. I started writing to politicians, I wrote to radio stations, television. I literally spent a full day emailing. At one point just begging for help. Nobody did anything. And that's when I knew from that moment that I was always going to fight with my everything, no matter what happened. No matter what happened with me, I was going to be damn sure that it was never going to happen to my daughter. After 5 weeks, Claire's daughter passed away. She said, knowing that the baby was dying, it was like I wanted to crawl out of my skin. I was being smothered. I wanted to unzip myself and walk away. A week after she buried her baby, which she named Alex, they planted her in the yard and actually planted a tree for her. She sat down in her parents' living room. She was still a mess, she said, but way more functional than she had been before. And she said, I'm gonna campaign. I'm gonna join a campaign and I'm gonna fight this. I don't know how or what I'm gonna do yet, but I am not gonna let this go until it's over. Initially, Claire was too traumatized to go out of the house. She began her activism on social media, tweeting at politicians with fierceness and a power. I've seen some of her tweets that are totally unimaginable, an anger that poured out of her from the protection of her home, but in this public sphere. Eventually, a journalist called her, and the journalist wanted to talk to her about her story. And Claire said, I wouldn't let her off the phone until I had told her the story. I needed to talk. Now, Claire's experience followed right after the death of Savita Halapanavra, who was an Indian immigrant to Ireland who had died following the complications from birth after being refused an abortion. And Savita's death galvanized a movement in Ireland to ban the Eighth Amendment, which in Ireland had prohibited abortion in almost all cases. As Claire's story became more public, other groups began to reach out to her and ask if she would be willing to join them, and she decided, I'm going to go for this. She joined the group in December, 2 months after the death of Alex, and then spent the next several years fighting tirelessly to get a referendum on the agenda. They eventually got it. They had 100 days once the referendum was announced to pull together a nationwide campaign to ban the Eighth. A growing movement coalesced with women's groups focused on fatal fetal abnormalities, with women's groups focused on kind of healthcare arguments, with feminist and anarcho-feminist groups that were also organizing on a range of different issues, and they created a coalition called Together for Yes. It was a mixture of all of these different groups. And Claire told her story. She told her story again and again and again in groups in people's homes and meetings in Waterford and in Dublin and all elsewhere across Ireland. She met so many other members of the community who had had similar stories. And she said, the anger is what sustained me. And grief eventually entered into the picture. If I hadn't had that coursing through me, the anger and the grief, I would have just been a mess. I would have literally been back in bed. Eventually, on the day of the referendum, as part of this project, I interviewed abortion activists from all across Ireland. And what was so interesting was that so many of them were optimistic about the vote, but they were very, 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 very nervous. Most of them anticipated maybe 51% of the population will turn out and vote to ban the Eighth. But certainly, nobody felt secure or safe going into this election. What surprised so many of them was how the Irish diaspora responded. Within the days of the referendum, immediately before, Irish citizens by the thousands began to return to Ireland, quote unquote, to come home to vote. As Claire put it, these people got off the plane, into the polling station, into the airport. One woman was in Ireland just for 4 hours and spent 28 hours traveling there and back, I think from Australia. It was incredible. Irish citizens from all over the globe came back to repeal the Eighth. Claire continued, there was just this thing on this day, and she started to cry. People were getting into their car to drive to the airport to pick somebody up, to take them to a polling station that they didn't even know, that they'd never meet again, just to make sure they got home for this. And that is the day, and that was the moment that I thought, whether we win or lose, we just created something here that is absolutely amazing. We have a culture here in Ireland that is all about humanity, compassion, and care. The referendum, as you may know, passed in a landslide with 68% of the population turning out to vote. Many saw the ban on abortion as linked to the legacies of Catholic domination and British imperialism that had carried on the violence of colonialism through women's bodies. And today, many of these activists are now fighting for a full island campaign, as abortion still is severely restricted in Northern Ireland. I'm going to tell you Anat's story next. Anat grew up in a single-parent home in a neighborhood of Tel Aviv. Her father was extremely violent, both physically but also financially. After her parents separated, it took 11 years for her mother to formally divorce her father because of the rabbinical council in Israel. And Anat described how the first crisis of her life was when her father left and he refused to pay child support. And after this protracted court battle between her mom and her dad, her mother ended up losing the house that Anat and her siblings were living in. And shortly thereafter, her mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Her treatment forced her business to fail, and her cancer treatment made the family financially insecure. Anat mentioned this and then described how as a child, she would just climb trees and talk to herself. She was kind of a self-described weirdo, as she put it to me. She said, as a first grader, her teachers wrote a song in a rhyme for every child in her class. And Anat recalled that for her, the teachers had created a rhyme that more or less joked, is Anat a boy or is Anat a girl? Anat said, I carried this question with me, am I a boy, am I a girl, with me as a first grader. And I was like, wow, now reflecting back, what an incredible question. They made it this cute thing. Everybody had a rhyme. That was my rhyme. Everyone called me a boy. I was very, very small. I looked like a boy, and I didn't go with a bra. Eventually, Anat came out to her family and friends, which she's described as the defining moment in her life. And as she put it, her queerness is what motivated her activism. Anat got involved in LGBT advocacy, organizing film festivals and large events related to LGBT equality. She became adept at producing campaigns and cultural events aimed at challenging the narrative and changing the narrative around LGBTQ issues. And one day she was in a training for a group of diverse Israelis and Palestinians who were interested in entering politics. They were on a lunch break, and as she put it, she was just kind of bored scrolling on her phone. A headline that caught her attention was of the murder of a young woman in Jaffa, basically next to Tel Aviv. She went back to the room and she saw that her working group in this training, they were all women at that moment. And she started talking with women in this group and talking about, what are we gonna do about this? We keep hearing these headlines of women being murdered by their husbands, by their boyfriends, by their fathers, by their mother's boyfriends. What are we gonna do about it? And as they kind of talked and they recognized the scale of the problem and they recognized the need to do something, as Anat put it, they couldn't decide on any course of action. They couldn't figure out what to do. For the next few weeks, every time a story about the murder or the brutal kind of abuse of a woman entered into the newspaper, she would take to WhatsApp and message her friends and basically say, let's do something. And people would say, no, it's Ramadan right now, so let's not. Or let's do this. No, somebody already did that. It's not time. And she said how, oh my God, I just started realizing, wow, I cannot galvanize the type of response that this egregious form of violence deserves. But then, there was a week in November of last year when the United Nations dubs it International Day Against Violence Against Women. And Bibi Netanyahu, or really Sarah Netanyahu, Bibi's wife, gave Anat and a lot of other feminist activists what she called a gift. On this day, Netanyahu and his wife had visited a shelter for battered women, and they were being given a tour on live TV. And Bibi remarked to the manager of the shelter, wow, I didn't know the scale of the problem. And the manager of the shelter says, what? You know, totally shocked. She's like, you should know this is a huge thing. You should know also that your coalition voted against a program that would provide 250 million shekels, this emergency program that would have provided services for these women. You voted against it. And he said something along, this is Anat's words, he said something along the lines of, oh, coalition, opposition brings something, coalition says no, and his wife says, it's not a matter of opposition and coalition. And this was the fire that the movement needed to put violence against women on center stage. Anat returned to organizing this coalition and trying to get her friends to commit to the work of rallying against gender-based violence. And at that moment, 2 girls were killed in 2 different parts of Israel. One, Silvana, by her mother's ex, who beat her to death at home. Another, Yara, went to buy bread and was horrifically attacked, assaulted, and ultimately dismembered. That night, in rage, Anat and her friends designed a logo and a campaign. This is a state of emergency. And when she was riding the train home that night, she described how she saw a similar looking event on Facebook that said, I am a woman, I strike. And it had a date associated with this Facebook event, December 4th, which was about 8 or 9 days from then. In Anat's words, she said, whoa, whoa. And actually, then she continued, and she says, they're really fucking up my business. I was the one trying to organize this site, or this march. She was immediately feeling sort of threatened by the competition, but then immediately reached out to this group, and they started to organize. They organized a strategy room. They created a first floor kind of layout in one of their houses where they were all pouring in 24 hours a day to begin to make branding for the campaign, to reach out to connect feminist organizations across Israel to join the planning, to begin actually thinking strategically about how we could market this in a way that would actually make national news and disrupt conversations and drive attention to this issue. One day, they began to call for a strike every day at 10 a.m. in the morning. Every day, women, men, and everybody, leave your homes, leave your jobs, and go stand on the streets for the same number of minutes that captures the number of people, a number of women that have been murdered by men in Israel thus far this year. So at that point, it was 24 minutes for the 24 people that have been murdered. And one day, artists placed an exhibition of red shoes, you see here, in a square at the center of Tel Aviv. You also see the creation of new die-ins, this idea that performance artists were spilling red paint and actually staging these protests every morning. And then on the actual day of the strike, December 4th, people of all political and religious bent stayed home from work. This was an attempt, as a strike does, to make your presence felt in the economy and in your home and so forth. And at the main event stage in Tel Aviv, a coalition that took to the stage was extremely diverse. In Anat's words, they were ultra-religious from all sides of the spectrum: Muslim, Jews, secular, religious, etc. Settlers, a lot of settlers, and progressives, Arab Israelis, Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. At least 30,000 people were in the streets, and others didn't show up for work that day. And the strike did eventually make national news. When Anat was describing what she thought the strike meant, certainly this wasn't the end-all goal, but it was a step. She said, the diversity of people on the stage and the diversity of people involved in planning that strike suggests something even more powerful, a turning point perhaps, and linking together the shared experiences of violence between people who have had very different experiences of violence from the state. It was an effort in building relationships that allowed different groups to end up on the stage that day. As Anat put it, Arabs know they don't want a settler on the stage. But in the planning process, we said, listen, what would an 8-year-old settler whose father is beating her at home do? Is it not her protest? It is her protest. Building relationships is what Anat is offering as an activist, to resist violence in any form by coalition building. that difficult, often exhausting, challenging work of bringing people with different priorities and different agendas together to see their shared suffering as a shared struggle. Doing so powerfully allows us to see the connectedness of these systems of violence, of occupation and patriarchy, of militarism and racism, to think about how these systems don't only mutually reinforce each other, but they are constitutive of each other. My final story is Kati. Kati is from Petare, Venezuela. As she puts it, I was born in extreme poverty. My family was very, very poor, and I always believed in I have a dream. To see everything differently, my mother had 4 sons, one had special needs. And in seeing so much need, it made me continue going forward. Kati became a baker, a very skilled baker that was sought after to produce birthday cakes, wedding cakes, and so forth. And for more than a decade, she had a very successful cake kind of store in her neighborhood. But the neighborhood she lived in remained impoverished and often subjected to violence. She described how ever since she was young, every day on the way to make beautiful cakes, she would walk through trash, lots and lots of trash. One day, about 10 years ago, her uncle, who was like her dad, who had raised her, was killed. No idea why. Shortly thereafter, her brother-in-law had been killed while attending a carnival. The violence of the surrounding neighborhoods began to touch her family very, very urgently and very immediately. Not knowing what to do, Kati came up with a plan to start where she could control it, by eliminating the trash. Everyone told her that cleaning up the neighborhood, challenging the local government, and so forth would be impossible. But she just started digging in a way that she called apolitical, just to recover the public space. She said she began to receive threats, aggressions, everything, but she continued. She became more active. In her cleanup, she organized the youth from the neighborhood. She began to bring other people out. And this kind of collective organization in public spaces got her thrown in prison, got her robbed, got her beaten up by the police, and it got her frequently and pervasively harassed by other members of her community for just trying to improve her neighborhood. She kept going. One day, there was a pacifist demonstration, and Kati decided that she could not stay quiet, that she needed to do something more, to go to a protest, to bring a banner, she said, to lift a flag, and she decided to take a more participatory role. This coincided with the rise of movements to resist the increasingly authoritarian government in Venezuela. And Kati became organized with the opposition, attending protests and organizing peaceful resistance, sometimes even through song. She also began to make the connections in her own life between the government oppression, the violence against her family that was seen as apolitical criminal violence, and the trash that she was constantly cleaning up. In 2017, she mobilized a group of artists and activists to start painting murals, like this one, behind the trash piles, this taken in her neighborhood, that she was constantly cleaning up. She kept going, and soon they're organized into an organization called Haciendo Ciudad, that basically began to do major community cleanups and then art installations and community garden planting. They expanded this work. She said, "Today I can say with pride that these spaces that were once covered in trash are now art." It is she said, on one side, on the community level, the goal is to unite people. Every person has a way of thinking. And these ways of thinking differ profoundly in Venezuela right now. You have pro-government supporters, Chavistas, Maduro supporters, of cultures, ideologies, and religion. It's difficult to bring everybody together to speak one language. She said, I talk to the evangelicals, they speak about God. I talk to the delinquents. I talk to the gang. I speak all of these languages. And the language is art. "We are Venezuelans, and that is something amazing," she said. "We need to unite." So then I felt through the reclaiming of space, through the re-territorialization of communities and of blocks that are associated with violence and with poverty and with oppression, that re-territorialization through this aesthetics of beauty and through art has created a powerful political statement that this is not okay. And she continues to be actively involved with the opposition in Venezuela. I want to end by telling you that these are just a few stories from the many that I've heard over the past few years through this work. I was, about 3 weeks ago, the 1st of September, I was just a few miles from here at the closing ceremony of the 2019 Igley Summer Institute, which we held at the National African American History of Museum and Culture. And we partnered this year with the U.S. Institute of Peace, and that's why we were in D.C. for a portion of it. We had women from South Sudan, from South Africa, from the Philippines, from Azerbaijan, women like Christine Ahn, who led a march of 10,000 women across the demilitarized zone in the Koreas, women like Koketso Moti, who have founded a powerful platform for women and for Black women in particular in South Africa to advance their rights and foster democracy, women like Kuzi Miranda from the Philippines, who works constantly to actually find better lives for internally displaced people while challenging the violent extremism that exists in the Philippines in so many forms. And one thing that I think lands every single time we've had these gatherings is the importance of cultivating resilience and of having conversations about the myriad forms of violence that people are subjected to in their lives, because fundamentally, trauma from violence that is transformed becomes transferred. These stories also remind me again and again that we should never accept the lazy idea that there are not enough capable, courageous women to take on leadership roles in resolving conflicts and strengthening civil societies and in building peace. And I fundamentally believe that building our vision of an inclusive and more just world that sees all violence as interconnected will require the mobilization of women who see their struggles as interconnected. And peace and equality is not possible unless we are liberated from violence in all of its forms. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berry, for that very interesting and beautiful talk, and I think you've given us some ideas of how to mobilize. Let's open it up to questions. Please, and it would be nice if we could get to the microphones so we can ask the questions, because we're running a little behind schedule.
Did you say that there's a movement in Northern Ireland now?
There is. It's.
Could you repeat the
yes,
question? Come up here, please. I'm just
sure.
going to moderate.
The question was whether there's a movement in Northern Ireland, and absolutely. And actually, I did a lot of interviews up in Belfast, and one of the things that struck me is that the movement in Northern Ireland for abortion rights is very tied to the same kind of nodes of organizing that mobilized for peace in the peace process. And so you see some of the same individuals who are involved in pushing for an end to the Troubles, actually very much in seeing the Troubles as linked to the forms of kind of embodied harm that comes from the state restrictions of abortion rights. And there's the abortion rights campaign ARC is a full island campaign, and that was one of the 3 major entities that drove the Together for Yes coalition forward, which is the big umbrella organization that helped with repealing the 8th. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I thought that was really moving and profound. Can you talk a little bit about the conditions of possibility for this kind of movement? Like, across the different spaces and stories, what makes this kind of mobilization possible?
Right. That's such a great question, and one that I think social movement scholars have failed to fully address what the conditions are that allow for movements to look like the movements we recognize as movements, right? We think of movements in the West oftentimes as people in the streets. In so many parts of the world, this is fundamentally impossible without severe risks to one's safety and security, right? The feminist approach to thinking about movements and drawing on kind of a vast literature on the micropolitics of resistance, thinking about how ordinary activities of a subaltern can actually be political and can manifest in political change, even if they don't look like the kind of mobilization, the protests, the banners, and so forth, I think is essential for us to consider. When I convene the group every year of activists, their activism looks radically different. It can look like Farida Naburema coming from Togo, who has been sort of the face of democracy movements in West Africa, challenging her dictator oftentimes very, very publicly. But it can also look like the way in which a woman from Colombia named Veronique, she is an Afro-Colombian woman who is queer and feminist and is mobilizing very subversively, not in the streets, but oftentimes by creating spaces of healing for people that are burning out, for people whose experience and exposure to violence is so pervasive and so ever present in their lives that they stop the work eventually. And so her politics and her mobilization is in that convening. And I think that that's important for us to also see as political, right? I think there are the question then becomes what is a movement, and how are movements grown, developed, and advanced, and how can we kind of actually think about transformation and transformative movements more broadly, because I think they're possible just about everywhere.
Thank you so much. I see some great people I know up there too.
Yay.
The piece is loud and Kathleen.
Yes, yes. Got Jamie.
It's great work.
Yeah.
Actually, building a little bit on this question of the conditions of possibility, I think I've had some informal conversations with folks about sort of thinking of constructive agency and constructive resilience in the face of oppression, sort of some of the characteristics of an approach that one sees in some of this activism, and as you say, movements that aren't always recognized as movements. And I'm wondering whether, I haven't yet found it, but if there could be like a clear articulation of some of its elements, and one that strikes me as very strong is coherence between means and ends, and almost a politics of means, where people are thinking about the building of what they want to see in the process of trying to deal with whatever they need to in the way. And it would just be extraordinary, I think, if there was clear articulation of that, and even in the sharing of all these experiences, something that could be offered that one can see across all of these. I'm sure there is work out there. It's not something I know that well, but just in the course of your work, I was wondering.
I mean, it's a great question. And I think the way that this has come up repeatedly in my conversations with so many of these activists comes back to that question of the feminist imagination. Movement activists that I've met oftentimes have a set of tactical, strategic goals at the forefront of their campaigns. It is about repealing the eighth, right? It is about getting the dictator out of power. It is about passing a piece of legislation. It is about toppling an administration. And those are important goals, right? But they are also extremely limited. And they don't necessarily take into account what comes next. I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but there's a quote by Frantz Fanon who basically says, we're not imagining what are we going to imagine after the last white policeman leaves? And it's this idea that we actually in our our planning and our thinking about how to kind of catalyze change have to think not in a reformist manner, but in a transformative manner. How are we actually seeking to build movements that change systems and then don't replicate the violence of those systems? How do we build movements that challenge and dismantle those systems, rebuilding more justice, more just, more inclusive, more democratic, more peaceful societies in the aftermath? And I think that is something that's come up when we add a feminist lens to the kind of training toolkit that is oftentimes centered in social movement conversations, which focuses on civil resistance and direct action, which focuses on community organizing, which focuses on peace building. And I think that those modalities, those approaches are powerful, important, and necessary. And then a feminist vision, a feminist umbrella over them allows us to say, okay, and then where is the future we want to build? So it's a beautiful question, and lots of other thinking, I think, to do on that, but I appreciate it very much.
I'm just interested in the question of how organizing, how internet access and communication access and being so varied all around the world, how is that playing a role in the kind of movements that you're talking about?
That's a great question, and it's so there's this digital age, and I think we oftentimes credit Twitter and Facebook as platforms that can help mobilize, people quickly into the streets, and certainly they've been remarkably important for those things. But I think that it's more complicated than that. We see oftentimes a movement, for instance, Ni Uno Menos, a movement in Argentina that brought at one point 2 million people to the streets, was largely a movement that happened around the hashtag Ni Una Menos, not one less woman in the world that will be taken out of the world because of gender-based violence and femicide. This massive movement, a massive kind of a number of people, about 2 million people that came to the streets in 2015 in Argentina, was catalyzed by Twitter and by a group of about 16 journalists who decided to make this a really, really, really prominent campaign, and focused it right after the kind of very visible and very high-profile murder of a young woman. But what this research for me has been really interesting to reveal is that the hashtag itself and the kind of massive mobilization of people would not have been possible without the much more deeply rooted community organizations, feminist organizers that had been doing work related to gender justice, racial justice, queer justice since the 1980s, if not before. But really before, coming out of the peace movement, countering the dirty war. And the Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, kind of, and as some of the most iconic women leaders in movements that have been protesting in a square in Buenos Aires every single Thursday since the 70s, these women set a model and a system in place, almost scaffolding kind of for the Ni Una Menos movement to really build on. And I think that is what we're seeing, is that social media is a powerful tool, but it's not an organizing apparatus in itself. It's actually not a structure. It's not horizontally organized. We see limitations in movements that are that rely heavily on hashtag activism. Bring back our girls as kind of an example of this, that spreads like wildfire, that goes viral, but doesn't necessarily fundamentally actually lead to social change. And when we do see social media basically serving as a powerful tool for organizing and galvanizing people, it's because it sits on top of these really, really profoundly community-rooted organizations and legacies of I think building for progressive change. So I think it's a complicated answer. I'll just add one little other detail, which is that social media is also has also created tremendous vulnerability for activists. We have a many countries around the globe have such sophisticated surveillance capacity that phones become a portal into our very movements. And so I work with a large number of activists now that don't even go on WhatsApp because it's not secure enough, right? And it requires, we do in our training every 6 months, a security basically protocol on your social media, on your phone, on your technologies, because governments are oftentimes using your digital devices to create new forms of vulnerability, and these vulnerabilities are gendered. We see women in the home or in the, in the store or wherever they are, oftentimes the routines that women have sometimes become a source of vulnerability, and phones can give some more access into what those routines are. And so I think that it becomes an important conversation to have about how they're advancing struggle or potentially weakening it in some ways. Yeah, thanks, Jane.
From your research, can I ask what was the main contribution in these movements, if they were involved and if they were not? If they were involved, how could have that made a difference?
In each of these movements?
Yeah.
How it made a difference in individual women's lives, or made a difference, like the movements made a difference?
As a movement, were the men involved? And if
men.
if they were not involved, were they involved? Would it have made a difference?
Oh, such a good question. I think it goes back to our first keynote, and one of my legendary feminists from India, Bahá'í, who was a participant in the first institute, she said over and over again during our week together, it's not about the sexual body, right? It's about whether they're feminists. And I think that this is a reminder that it's not just about adding women in. It's not just about the kind of, again, the biological. It's about thinking through a feminist vision, a feminist lens that takes power seriously. And so men in all of these movements that I mentioned have played different roles. I mean, very different roles. In the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina, for instance, much of the organizing that came out for abortion rights was rooted in queer activism. Queer activism had an extremely strong kind of community of gay men that had been organizing for decades. And so the abortion movement in some ways built on some of that organizing in the LGBT community. Men were also in the streets. Men in Argentina, many young men, you'll see them wearing a green bandana, Ola Verde, this sign of that they support reproductive choice, reproductive justice. And it's very much become a collaborative, I think, movement, because in part the violence is seen as linked, right? Violence is seen as linked to the authoritarian regime that murdered tens of thousands of people during the Dirty War, that left a very, very difficult series of governments in place, that has created a massive financial crisis, that has created a debt crisis. Debt crisis leads women to stay in abusive relationships. Abusive relationships lead to femicide, right? These are the kind of connections between these legacies of violence that I think men and women in Argentina are certainly seeing. In the abortion rights campaign in Ireland, and certainly I could talk about all these different movements. They're all very, very different, and they're also not homogenous. These movements are very heterogeneous. They have different facets, different factions. They have anarcho-feminists right by liberal feminists kind of fighting for similar agendas. And I think it's important for the abortion rights campaign to say that certainly there have been many men kind of supporting these conversations, but also saying this is also a space where women and other gendered bodies that can bear children are needing to take center stage and be centered in the conversations, because men are not bearing children. So great question, and I feel like I could just talk. I feel like I used to be a Rwanda expert. That's what I thought I started my career doing, and then I stopped being able to do research in Rwanda. And ever since I've started doing research in so many different places. I feel like I'm sort of all over the place now, and it's a gift, and it also means that I could answer this question for the next hour. So I should probably stop in the interest of time.
One more question. Okay. One more. Last one.
What really impressed me is in these cases, is bringing together people from across battle lines. You have the example, I also refuse to demonstrate with the settler.
Yeah.
But that's key in all of them. My question is, how much of that lasts? For example, I know Northern Ireland better than I know the abortion campaign in Ireland, and the women certainly worked across lines. So with the anti-abortion movement, how much of that remained after they won? Or any of the other examples, the taking the trash away, putting paintings up and so on, how much was created that managed to overcome the issues between many of these communities, and they kept them working together afterwards?
Oh, yes. And Anat would say the day after the strike, the solidarity disappeared. Right? She did say that, but she said it created a blueprint. And I think the creation of blueprints for how these types of communities might be built, might be imagined, how collaboration might happen, how leadership that is less hierarchical and less replicative of forms of violence might actually work for a small goal, a single day, a single strike. If we have a blueprint, is it possible to grow that, to nourish that, to build that? And in all of these cases, I think that most of the case, I wouldn't speak for all of the activists by any means, but to my knowledge, I think most of them would say that once you've created personal connections and there's been a kindness at a human level across different divides and in recognition of the way in which all of us are oftentimes affected by the big systems of violence, patriarchy, militarism, capitalism, if you will, the way in which these big systems of violence disadvantage so many people, that there's kind of kernels to build on, to build from the future. And that's the optimistic read, which is my talk today. My talk tomorrow is the pessimistic. No, I'm just kidding.